For the past several months, as I have participated in and watched major competitive Universus events, I have been left with a burning question. Where's Pieck? Well, the obvious answer is she's right here beneath my piece of paper. But in a Universus sense, she has had zero results. And this is a character that I thought was extremely strong upon her reveal in Attack on Titan Apocalypse. I thought that this character was very, very similar to characters like Godzilla and Rodan, where they just play solid, fundamental Universus better than other characters. But she has not only put up zero results over the past several competitive events, she hasn't even been there. Nobody's even bothering to show up with the character. She's been completely MIA. So, what happened to Pieck? And I have put a lot of thought into this question, probably too much thought. And I have three explanations. The first two are pretty obvious, and then the third one I think is a little more subtle. So, first, she wasn't very well meta positioned when she first came out. When she first came out, she came out at the same time as 9 Titans from throughout the ages and Unyielding Destruction. Because of Unyielding Destruction, and, you know, Deku was very popular before Unyielding, but Deku also got to be a control character with inherent Unyielding Destruction protection because he gets to flash it and keep his stage. So Deku became more popular, I would say, with Attack on Titan Apocalypse in the meta. And then we had backup decks became a major part of the meta. So when Pieck was first released, we actually had overseas events happen before a United States event. The Louisville regional was the first regional post Attack on Titan Apocalypse. But we had a Europe event and a Australia event before that time. And in both of those events, Pieck was pretty well represented and put up very good results. I think she actually won one of those two events. But then came Louisville, and I was actually a Pieck player in Louisville, so I know her meta positioning really, really well. And in Louisville, backup decks really dominated the day, and we saw Mitchell do very, very well with a Midoriya deck. And I knew that Pieck really didn't have a solid matchup into these two archetypes. And so actually going into Louisville, I had all of my sideboard was backup hate. All 10 cards in my sideboard was basically preparing for Hanj and Zeke. And then Deku, I had a ton of practice in, and I really drilled in my timing and how I would attack the character. And I would say that I took a 20% win rate up to a 40% win rate, but I was still very much on the losing expectation against these matchups. But I felt really, really strong as Pieck into the field. And so I started off my day going 4-0, playing against just general characters. And then once I got to the top tables, I ended up playing Michu's Deku, and I lost in a pretty hard-fought battle. But it was close. And then on my win and in, I lost to a backup deck, despite my sideboard. Still lost, and just couldn't quite make it. And I think even if I had top cut, I probably wasn't going to be well positioned because Louisville was so backup heavy. I think it surpassed everybody's expectations and how backup heavy it really ended up being. So the simplest answer is Pieck wasn't well meta positioned. And even after 9 Titans was banned, then we had Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles come out with Equipment Heist, and then it became all about how can we cheat in our massive mutant machines and just break Equipment Heist. And, you know, these two cards really were putting stats on attacks at an insane rate very, very early on, and they were just outpacing Pieck. And Deku hasn't lost any popularity. So, you know, sometimes the simplest explanation is also the correct one, and that's that she wasn't well meta positioned. Okay, there's also a second explanation, and that is simply that Pieck was an Attack on Titan character. And Attack on Titan simply hasn't been popular amongst Universus players. Part of the reasoning is that Attack on Titan used manga art, and as we can see, sometimes this Attack on Titan manga art was really, really rough. Attack on Titan introduced blitzes instead of enhances, introduced single symbol cards, introduced some new abilities like Ruin and Foundation Destruction, never ends up being the most popular amongst players. And also, it doesn't help that Pieck wasn't really like Levi or Mikasa. You know, she's not a super ultra popular Attack on Titan character. She's very, very much just a side character, mostly in the show. But I think that there's an explanation that explains the disappearance of Pieck even beyond that. And it's simply put, restraint. Okay, there was a study done several years ago where scientists showed kids a marshmallow, and they put them alone in a room with a marshmallow. And they said, hey, if you don't eat the marshmallow for 5 minutes, then you can have 2 marshmallows. And then they would leave them alone. And then the kids that didn't eat the marshmallows and the kids that did eat the marshmallows, they tracked their results later in life. And they found that the kids who were more patient and had more willpower to not eat the marshmallow and ended up getting the 2 marshmallows also had better results later on in life. Now, the results of that study have been somewhat disputed recently, but I think it's a pretty common sense finding, is that restraint and more willpower leads to better outcomes. And Universus is already a card game where restraint really, really pays off. You know, you see beginners very frequently. We say that they see orange, they play orange. They just play, they use their their turn 1 to build foundations. And then from there, they're just, whenever they draw attacks, they're just playing the attacks and they're just pressing all the buttons that they possibly can. And that doesn't lead to solid experiences. You know, you see that the best players in Universus are capable of sculpting their way into a good kill string, and they know when to press buttons and they know when to hold off on pressing buttons to save them up for later turns. Well, Pieck is a character that asks you to show a lot of restraint. You know, her abilities come with costs. She has to sacrifice a foundation. And then you may transform this character, but you don't have to transform this character. So if you transform this character, then you can again sacrifice a foundation for +3 or -3 speed, and then you may transform the character. So there's a lot of thinking here. The first thing is, do I want to sacrifice a foundation to have the effect? And then it's, when I do play the effect, do I want to transform? And the timing of this really, really matters, because this is a first enhance. And so if you don't transform to this front side before your next attack, then you're going to lose out on the ability to play this. If you play the building the top card of your deck face down before this first enhance, then you're not going to get the ability to play this. When you transform, you get the opportunity to build in your anti-Titan artillery. And so I see a lot of characters that play Pieck, and they're just pressing the buttons all the time. They're always using Pieck's abilities, and it's resulting in their stage being really, really heavily taxed, and they just never quite get there versus their rival. Now, compare this to characters like Rodan and Godzilla that also play strong fundamental universes. Well, these characters really aren't asking you questions. You just always do the thing. Like with Rodan, even though it's technically, lends itself to a more control type character, and we typically think, oh, a more control character must mean more skill intensive, right? Because you're having more opportunities to play the game and more decisions that end up mattering. But you're always playing the ability. They remove the top card of your deck really isn't that much of a cost. It's a cost maybe in 2% of matchups where you end up being in a mill out situation. Say it's control versus control deck, and now the clock is on you more than it's on your rival. We saw that in the finals of Albuquerque when Travis played against Drew. That the removal became a serious cost. But in 98% of matches, it's not really a cost. And so you're always playing the enhance. I always want the speed, or I always want the minus speed. I might as well just play it. With Godzilla, you're always getting the +3 damage. Yes, it comes at a deck building cost of having only printed difficulty 5 or greater moves, but you're always getting the 3 damage. And then the spending of momentum for your next check, it's pretty obvious when you need to be doing that. The only questions these characters really ask are the first form of Godzilla, when are you going to press that button? And the bottom enhance on Rodan, when are you going to scout the top cards of your deck? But most of the time, you are always using your character abilities, no question. It's really not so with Pieck. A lot of times on those early turns with Pieck, you might play a poke and then just use Pieck to build the top card of your deck. And then you might wait, actually, until maybe even your turn 3 to build in your anti-Titan artillery because you don't want to be sacrificing your foundations on your early turns. And then when you're playing defense, you really need to know, are you going to be using the speed or are you going to be using the damage side? And then it comes also with a lot of deck building of how are we going to get around this cost of having to sacrifice our stage. It reminds me a lot of the character Momo from early MHA days. Momo saw really, really solid results, but never the highest representation amongst players. Why? Because she asks you a lot of questions. She asks, each of her abilities come with a cost of destroy a foundation. Build an asset or weapon foundation from your card pool face up. This attack gets +2 or -2 speed. And then once per turn, remove a foundation, add a weapon card from your discard pile to your hand. So there's a lot of questions being asked by this character. And it's not, she's not such a simple character just to pick up and beginners are going to do well. Whereas beginners could definitely just go and pick up a Nomu deck. They could go and pick up a Jiro deck. Now, I'm not saying that they could play those characters the most optimally, but it's going to be a lot easier out the gate because you're always going to be using your character. It's never a wrong decision to use a character ability, and the timing is really quite simple. So I think that that is the biggest reason why Pieck Finger has been totally MIA in major events. It's just that when you do have characters like Rodan and Godzilla that are much more straightforward, players tend to pile into those compared to characters like Pieck, where you're just being asked a lot of questions and you're being asked to practice a lot of restraint. Now, don't get me wrong. The first part of this video about the meta not being right has definitely played a significant factor. And I do actually think that with the recent bans of Nine Titans and Equipment Heist and Unyielding Destruction, I think Pieck is actually extremely well positioned in this meta and could definitely make a run at Worlds. The question will be, will she even be there?